Welcome back. Tonight, we're walking through the gates of 8th century Chang'an as the West Market opens to the world. Not the sterile trade depot you might imagine, but a living symphony of frankincense and saffron, where a Syrian monk examines silk that captures starlight, and Sogdian merchants transform months of desert crossing into moments of profitable connection. Just a story of ancient globalization, cultural fusion, and the discovery that humanity's hunger for connection has always transcended borders. If you find wonder in these forgotten worlds where civilizations met and merged, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Drop a comment about which ancient city you'd most want to visit. There's something profound about knowing we're all connected through these timeless human stories. So, dim the lights. Let's begin with a Sogdian merchant adjusting his silk-lined coat in the pre-dawn chill, his boots carrying dust from Samarkand as Chang'an's great gates creak open like destiny itself. Chapter 5. Cities and Caravanserais, centers of exchange along the Silk Roads. In the hour before dawn, when the air still carries the cool breath of night, the great gates of Chang'an's West Market creak open like the slow unfurling of destiny itself. The sound echoes across the sleeping city, a deep, resonant groan of wood and iron that seems to awaken not just the marketplace, but the very spirit of connection that has drawn merchants across continents for centuries. As the first caravans rumble through the gateway, their wooden wheels striking the stone pavement in rhythmic percussion, the greatest cosmopolitan gathering in the medieval world begins another day of wonder. The Sogdian merchant adjusts his silk-lined coat against the morning chill, his breath visible in small puffs as he directs his men toward the covered pavilions where precious cargo awaits inspection. His boots, practical leather reinforced with felt, have carried him from Samarkand through the jade gate at Yumen, across deserts where the horizon shimmers like molten bronze, and through mountain passes where eagles nest among clouds. Now, in this vast rectangular space that could hold 10,000 people, he prepares to transform months of arduous travel into moments of profitable exchange. Water gurgles through the stone channels that line the market's main avenues, a gentle counterpoint to the growing symphony of commerce. Persian fire worshippers kindle small flames in portable bronze braziers, their morning prayers ascending with smoke that carries the sweet scent of frankincense. A Nestorian monk from distant Syria, his travel-worn robes still dusty from the journey, examines bolts of silk that seem to capture starlight in their fibers, threads so fine they appear almost ethereal, dyed in colors that have no names in his native tongue. The air itself tells stories. Cinnamon bark from Ceylon mingles with the green freshness of tea from the southern mountains, while the earthy musk of Bactrian camels speaks of desert crossings and oasis rests. Saffron from Kashmir perfumes the morning breeze, precious as gold dust, while somewhere among the stalls, someone is grinding cardamom seeds, releasing their warm, citrusy essence into the growing bustle. This is Chang'an in the 8th century, not merely a city, but a living testament to humanity's ancient hunger for connection. Here, where the morning light strikes the upturned eaves of wooden buildings and illuminates hanging lanterns still flickering from the night, the world has gathered. The Tamil spice merchant, whose grandfather sailed with monsoon winds from Pulicat, converses in careful Chinese with the Armenian goldsmith, whose family fled westward when the Sassanid Empire crumbled. Between them, they speak a dozen languages, but their transaction requires only the universal syntax of mutual respect and fair exchange. The Oasis Awakening. Long before Chang'an became the terminus of dreams, before its 1 million inhabitants made it the largest city on earth, the seeds of these great gathering places were sown in the oases of Central Asia, where geography itself seemed to conspire in favor of human connection. In the valleys where rivers carried snowmelt from distant peaks, where underground channels called qanats brought precious water to the surface, settlements grew like gardens in the wilderness. The story begins in the mists of prehistory, when nomadic herders first recognized the strategic value of places where water emerged from the earth, like gifts from hidden gods. Archaeological excavations beneath modern Samarkand reveal layer upon layer of human habitation stretching back 5 millennia. Pottery fragments that speak of settled communities, bronze artifacts that whisper of trade connections, and the foundations of structures that house dreams of permanence and landscapes that seemed to favor only movement. In these early settlements we can trace the first experiments in creating spaces where different peoples could gather safely. The circular plans of Bronze Age settlements with their central courtyards surrounded by residential areas already contain the essential elements that would later define the great caravanserais. Protected spaces where strangers could meet, common areas where goods could be displayed and evaluated, and defensive arrangements that provided security without sacrificing the openness necessary for trade. The Sogdians, those remarkable people who would become history's first truly international merchants, emerged from this ancient tradition of oasis hospitality. Their homeland, centered on the fertile valleys around Samarkand and Bukhara, taught them lessons that would prove invaluable when they began to extend their reach across continents. They understood that water was life, that security enabled trust, and that prosperity came not from isolation, but from connection. By the time Chinese historical records first mentioned the western regions, in the 2nd century BCE, Sogdian communities had already established a network of settlements that stretched from their homeland to the edges of the Chinese Empire. These were not random trading posts but carefully planned communities designed to support the complex logistics of long-distance commerce. Each settlement included not only the obvious requirements, markets, warehouses, accommodation for travelers, but also the infrastructure necessary to maintain cultural identity across vast distances. Temples for religious observances, schools for educating merchant children, workshops for maintaining the crafts that gave each community its distinctive character. Samarkand arose in such a place, where the Zarafshan River, whose name means gold-bearing, spreads its life-giving waters across a broad valley. When Alexander the Great first beheld Maracanda, as the Greeks called it, from the heights above the river in 329 BCE, he gazed upon a city already ancient, its foundations reaching back through centuries of patient cultivation. The citadel rose from the valley floor like a man-made mountain, its mud-brick walls reflecting the golden light of evening, while beyond stretched fields of wheat and barley, orchards of apricots and pomegranates, and gardens where roses bloomed in carefully tended rows. The approach to ancient Samarkand would have overwhelmed visitors with its sensory richness, miles before reaching the city walls. Travelers would smell the smoke of countless cooking fires, the sweet scent of fruit trees in blossom, and the green fragrance of irrigation channels carrying water to distant fields. The sound of the city carried across the valley, the rhythmic thud of water wheels, the musical chatter of market crowds, the calls of vendors announcing their wares in a dozen different languages. But Alexander's soldiers, weary from campaigns that had carried them from Macedonia to the edges of India, saw more than agricultural prosperity. They recognized the strategic genius of location, how the city commanded not just the fertile valley, but the convergence of routes that led through mountain passes toward China, south toward the Indian kingdoms, west toward Persia and the Mediterranean world. In this recognition lay the seed of what would become the greatest network of exchange in human history. The Sogdians, those remarkable people who would become the master facilitators of continental trade, understood this geography in their bones. From their homeland around Samarkand and Bukhara, they spread along the emerging routes, like gardeners, planting way stations in a vast landscape. Their settlements followed water, springs that bubbled from underground streams, rivers that descended from snow-capped peaks, lakes that reflected the changing sky. At each of these precious points they built not merely stopping places, but centers of civilization in miniature. Archaeological excavations in the ruins of ancient Samarkand reveal the layers of this patient building. Beneath the Islamic monuments that visitors see today lie the foundations of Sogdian halls, Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian fire temples, and Christian churches. Fragments of painted murals show us wedding processions, where brides wear Chinese silk and Indian pearls. Diplomatic ceremonies, where ambassadors from a dozen lands present gifts that speak of friendship across vast distances. Hunting scenes where Persian nobles ride Arabian horses, while Chinese courtiers observe from silk pavilions. The development of these oasis cities followed patterns as ancient as human settlement itself, yet their specific character emerged from the unique demands of long-distance trade. Unlike agricultural towns that grew organically around fields and pastures, or military settlements that prioritized defense above all, these places had to balance multiple requirements. They needed strong walls to protect valuable goods and their owners, but also open markets where strangers could gather safely. They required secure storage for merchandise that might rest for months awaiting favorable conditions, but also facilities for the rapid transfer of goods between different types of transport. They needed to accommodate diverse populations with varying religious needs, dietary restrictions. The solution that emerged was architectural and social genius. The typical Silk Road city developed a nested structure, a central citadel containing the ruler's palace and treasury, surrounded by the Shakristan or main city with its bazaars, workshops, and residential quarters, all enclosed by protective walls. Beyond these lay the Rabad or suburbs, where caravanserais provided accommodation for traveling merchants, where gardens and orchards supplied fresh food, and where various crafts that required space or produced noise and smoke could operate without disturbing the urban core. The web tightens. By the time the Han Dynasty of China was establishing regular diplomatic contact with the western regions in the 2nd century BCE, the Sogdians had already created something unprecedented in human history, a commercial network that functioned across cultures, languages, religions, and political boundaries. Their achievement was not simply the establishment of trading posts, but the creation of systems, methods of credit, standards of measurement, protocols for dispute resolution, and codes of conduct that enabled strangers to do business with confidence across distances that required months to traverse. The foundation of this network rested on innovations that seem almost modern in their sophistication. Sogdian merchants developed forms of commercial credit that allowed value to be transferred across vast distances without the physical movement of precious metals, a system that required extraordinary levels of trust and institutional reliability. Letters of credit written in Sogdian script have been discovered in sites stretching from the Black Sea to the Gobi Desert, testifying to the reach and reliability of these early banking networks. The standardization of weights and measures represented another crucial innovation. Sogdian merchants carried with them sets of bronze weights that conformed to standards recognized from Bukhara to Beijing, enabling rapid and accurate transactions, even when buyer and seller shared no common language. These standards were not imposed by political authority but emerged from practical necessity and were maintained by the collective self-interest of the merchant communities that depended on them. Even more remarkable was the development of commercial law that could function across political boundaries. Sogdian trading communities established courts with jurisdiction over commercial disputes that could involve parties from different empires, following different legal traditions and worshipping different gods. These courts relied on evidence and witnesses rather than religious oaths, on written contracts rather than personal relationships, and on arbitration rather than royal decree. The legal principles they developed influenced commercial law development across Eurasia and provided foundations for the international trading codes that would eventually enable global commerce. The Caravanserais became the physical embodiment of these systems. More than mere hostels, these structures represented a revolution in the organization of space for commercial purposes. The classic design, a rectangular enclosure with a single heavily fortified entrance opening onto a central courtyard, addressed multiple needs with elegant efficiency. Along the inner walls ran arcaded galleries providing shelter for both goods and people, while the center remained open for the loading and unloading of pack animals, for the display of merchandise, and for the social interactions that lubricated the machinery of trade. At Rabati Malik, whose magnificent ruins still rise from the desert between Bukhara and Samarkand, we can trace the sophistication of these institutions. Built in the 11th century during the reign of the Caravanserais dynasty, this caravanserai served as both commercial facility and symbol of royal authority. The entrance portal, 18 meters high and decorated with intricate geometric patterns in fired brick, announced to approaching caravans that they had reached a place of safety and prosperity. The scale of Rabati Malik speaks to the enormous volume of trade that passed through Central Asia during the medieval period. The central courtyard could accommodate several hundred pack animals, while storage areas along the walls provided secure space for goods worth more than the annual revenues of small kingdoms. Guest quarters were arranged in a hierarchy that reflected both commercial and social status. Private rooms with locking doors for wealthy merchants, shared accommodations for their employees and guards, and simple shelters for the drivers and animal handlers whose labor made the entire enterprise possible. Inside, archaeological evidence reveals the complex infrastructure that made such places function. Living quarters lined the walls, not simple dormitories, but private chambers where merchants could secure their valuable goods while they slept. A mosque provided for religious observances, while a bathhouse offered the luxury of hot water after weeks in the desert. The kitchen could prepare meals for hundreds, and stables accommodated the camels, horses, and mules whose strength made the entire enterprise possible. Most crucially, a sardoba, a domed underground reservoir, stored precious water collected from seasonal rainfall and distant springs. The engineering required to construct and maintain these facilities demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both architecture and logistics. The thick walls that provided security also served as thermal mass, keeping interiors cool during blazing summer days and warm during frigid winter nights. Ventilation systems drew fresh air through the complex without creating drafts that might scatter loose goods or extinguish oil lamps. Drainage systems handled both rainwater and waste, preventing the sanitation problems that could devastate crowded facilities. But the true innovation of these places lay not in their physical arrangements, but in the social technologies they fostered. Here, merchants from different cultures developed the commercial instruments that enabled long-distance trade. letters of credit that allowed value to be transferred without the risk of carrying actual coins across bandit-infested routes, standardized weights and measures that facilitated transactions between people using different systems, agreements for shared risk that distributed the costs of inevitable losses among multiple partners, and protocols for resolving disputes that relied on commercial law rather than the political authority of particular rulers. The daily operations of a major caravanserai reveal the complexity of managing international commerce in an era before modern communication. Merchants arriving from different directions brought not only goods but information, reports of political conditions along various routes, news of market prices in distant cities, warnings about bandit activity or natural obstacles that might affect travel plans. This information had commercial value in itself and was traded as carefully as any physical commodity. The timing of commercial activities followed rhythms dictated by both practical necessity and cultural sensitivity. Muslim merchants required facilities for their 5 daily prayers and needed assurance that food had been prepared according to Islamic dietary laws. Chinese traders brought their own interpreters and insisted on conducting business according to protocols that reflected Confucian concepts of hierarchical respect. Persian fire worshippers needed access to sacred flames and materials for their religious observances. Successful caravanserais accommodated all these requirements while maintaining the neutral atmosphere necessary for profitable exchange. Record-keeping systems developed in these facilities influenced administrative practices across Eurasia. Merchants maintained detailed logs of their transactions, not only for their own use but as evidence in case of disputes. Caravanserai managers kept registries of guests, inventories of stored goods, and accounts of services provided. These records, written in multiple languages and scripts, provide modern historians with detailed information about the volume and variety of Silk Road trade, but they also demonstrate the sophisticated bureaucratic systems that made such commerce possible. The social mixing that occurred in caravanserais created its own innovations. Merchants who might be competitors in their home markets found themselves dependent on each other for security and information during long journeys. These relationships fostered the development of commercial partnerships that crossed cultural and religious boundaries, creating business networks that proved remarkably resilient to political disruptions. Language learning became a practical necessity that had broader cultural implications. Successful merchants needed working knowledge of at least 3 or 4 languages, and many spoke 6 or more with varying degrees of fluency. This multilingual environment accelerated the exchange of ideas, techniques, and cultural practices. Mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and artistic techniques spread along trade routes as readily as spices and silks. The influence of caravanserai culture extended far beyond the world of commerce. The architectural principles developed in these buildings influenced the design of palaces, religious complexes, and public buildings throughout the regions they served. The social protocols that enabled peaceful interaction between diverse populations provided models for diplomatic practices and urban governance. The legal innovations that resolved commercial disputes contributed to the development of international law and cross-cultural jurisprudence. The Sogdians proved particularly gifted at these innovations. Their language became the lingua franca of Silk Road commerce, and Sogdian merchants established communities in cities from Bukhara to Beijing. Letters discovered in the ruins of watchtowers along the Chinese frontier, written in Sogdian script on paper and leather, reveal the workings of commercial networks that spanned continents. A merchant in Samarkand could send instructions to his agent in Chang'an regarding the purchase of silk, confident that his letter would be understood, and his credit honored when it arrived months later. The city of Chang'an itself, as it developed under the Sui and early Tang dynasties, represented the culmination of this oasis model adapted to imperial scale. Founded on a site chosen partly for its position at the convergence of trade routes, the Tang capital employed the same nested structure as Central Asian cities, but expanded to accommodate over 1 million inhabitants at its 8th century peak. The city's layout reflected careful attention to the needs of international commerce, separate markets for different categories of goods, designated quarters for foreign merchants organized by country of origin, and diplomatic protocols that balanced the security needs of the empire with the commercial requirements of trade. The construction of Tang Chang'an between 582 and 592 CE represents one of history's most ambitious urban planning projects. The city covered an area of 84 square kilometers, making it larger than contemporary Constantinople and far exceeding any European city of the period. The planners laid out the city according to principles that balanced imperial grandeur with practical considerations of commerce, defense, and daily life for a diverse population. The grid system that organized Chang'an's streets created a rational framework that could accommodate growth and change while maintaining order. The city was divided into 108 walled wards, each with its own gates that could be closed at night for security. Within this structure, foreign merchants were assigned to specific areas where they could maintain their cultural practices while remaining integrated into the city's economic life. The Persian ward clustered around a Zoroastrian fire temple, the Korean quarter included Buddhist monasteries, and the Arab section featured one of China's earliest mosques. The two great markets of Chang'an, the East Market serving primarily domestic trade, and the West Market handling international commerce, represented the culmination of centuries of experimentation in organizing commercial space. The West Market alone covered 900 acres and contained more than 4,000 shops arranged along streets designated for specific categories of goods. The Silk Street displayed the imperial workshops, finest products alongside fabrics imported from Central Asia and India. The Spice Quarter filled the air with aromas from across the known world: cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from Malabar, saffron from Kashmir, and cardamom from the Himalayan foothills. The scale of commercial activity in Chang'an required innovations in urban management that influenced city administration throughout East Asia. Market inspectors maintained standards for weights and measures, quality control for various products, and pricing fairness for both domestic and foreign merchants. Commercial courts handled disputes according to Tang legal codes that incorporated provisions for international trade, while diplomatic protocols ensured that visiting merchants received protection and fair treatment regardless of their political relationships with the Chinese Empire. The cosmopolitan character of Chang'an extended far beyond its commercial districts. The imperial court actively recruited talent from across Eurasia, creating a governmental bureaucracy that included administrators from Central Asia, military officers from the Turkish steppes, and cultural advisors from Korea and Japan. This diversity influenced everything from court ceremonial to architectural styles, creating a unique synthesis of traditions that represented the Tang dynasty's vision of universal empire. Foreign students came to Chang'an to study in institutions that had no equivalent elsewhere in the world. The Imperial University enrolled young men from across East Asia who returned to their home countries, carrying Chinese learning, administrative techniques, and cultural practices. Buddhist monasteries served as centers for international scholarship, where monks from India, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia gathered to translate Sanskrit texts into Chinese and to pursue philosophical investigations that influenced religious thought across the region. The daily rhythm of life in Chang'an reflected its character as a meeting place of civilizations. Morning markets brought together Chinese farmers from the surrounding countryside, with Central Asian merchants displaying the night's arrivals from caravan traffic. Afternoon symposiums and winehouses featured poetry competitions, where Chinese scholars matched verses with visiting intellectuals from Persia and Arabia. Evening entertainment districts offered performances that blended musical traditions from across Eurasia. Chinese instruments accompanying Persian dances, Korean songs adapted to Arabic rhythms, Indian theatrical techniques applied to Chinese stories. The Golden Convergence. In the gentle hour when afternoon light slants through the covered bazaars of 8th century Chang'an, casting long shadows between the wooden pillars that support tile roofs heavy with the memory of rain, the medieval world achieves a moment of perfect balance. Here, in the West Market where regulations require that all foreign trade must be conducted, the streams of commerce that have flowed for centuries across mountain and desert converge in an atmosphere of ordered prosperity that will never be equaled. The market itself stretches across 900 acres, larger than some entire cities, its streets, laid out in the precise geometry that Tang planners favored. Broad north-south avenues intersected by narrower east-west lanes, all designed to channel the flow of goods and people with maximum efficiency. But within this rational framework pulses something far more complex, the organic rhythm of cultural exchange that transforms mere commercial transaction into the creation of shared human experience. Along the covered galleries that line the main thoroughfares, merchants arrange their wares with the care of artists preparing exhibitions. Bolts of silk from the imperial workshops, their surfaces rippling with patterns of phoenixes and dragons, rest beside carpets woven in distant Bukhara, their deep reds and blues seeming to glow with inner fire. Syrian glass catches and refracts the filtered light, while Indian ivory gleams pale as moonlight against the dark wood of the display tables. The very air seems to shimmer with possibility. A Persian merchant, his pointed cap marking his origin as clearly as any passport, discusses the finer points of saffron cultivation with a Chinese official whose silk robes whisper as he moves. Between them, a small pile of the precious threads glows like captured sunset, each strand worth more than silver, representing the labor of thousands of flowers, the knowledge of generations, and the trust that enables such treasures to travel across a world where bandits and storms can destroy months of investment in a single hour. The sounds of this convergence create their own music. From the street of metalworkers comes the rhythmic tapping of hammers, shaping bronze mirrors and silver vessels, while nearby the silk weavers, shuttles, click and counterpoint, creating the luxury fabrics that give these roads their name. Musicians from a dozen traditions tune their instruments in preparation for evening performances, the pipa from China, the oud from Arabia, the chang from Persia, while in the tea-houses, scholars debate philosophy in languages that have traveled as far as the spices that flavor their drinks. Chang'an in this golden age housed foreign populations that transformed it into something unprecedented. A truly cosmopolitan city where diversity was not merely tolerated but actively cultivated as a source of imperial prestige. The foreign quarter housed perhaps 25,000 non-Chinese residents, merchants, diplomats, students, and artisans who had chosen to make their lives in this distant capital. Zoroastrian fire temples stood beside Buddhist monasteries and Nestorian churches, while the imperial court employed administrators from Central Asia, musicians from Korea, and bodyguards from the Turkish steppes. The integration went beyond mere coexistence. Archaeological evidence from Chang'an reveals workshops where Chinese artisans adapted foreign motifs, creating hybrid objects that spoke of cultural fusion. Silver vessels decorated with Persian patterns but shaped according to Chinese preferences. Textiles that combined Byzantine weaving techniques with Chinese silk, and religious art that translated Buddhist concepts into forms comprehensible to Confucian sensibilities. This cosmopolitan flowering reached similar heights in the great Central Asian cities that served as intermediary points between China and the West. Samarkand, under the Samanid dynasty in the 9th and 10th centuries, became a center of Persian cultural renaissance, where poets like Rudaki celebrated the beauty of their city in verses that travelers carried to courts from Baghdad to Beijing. The Samanids, claiming descent from ancient Persian nobility, consciously fostered an atmosphere of learning and artistic achievement that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Bukhara, chosen as the Samanid capital in 892, epitomized this synthesis of commercial prosperity and intellectual achievement. The city's title, Bukhara-ye Sharif, or Noble Bukhara, reflected its reputation as a center of Islamic learning where the great library rivaled those of Baghdad and Cairo. Here, the scholar Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, pursued the medical and philosophical investigations that would influence European thought for centuries. The interplay between commercial wealth and intellectual activity created a cultural dynamism that found expression in architecture, poetry, music, and the decorative arts. The buildings that rose during this period speak of confidence and aesthetic sophistication. The tomb of Ismail Samani, constructed in the early 10th century, demonstrates mastery of fired brick construction that creates surfaces of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The structure appears almost to breathe as light moves across its facades, the geometric patterns shifting and flowing like frozen music. Such architectural achievements required not only skilled craftsmen but also the economic foundation that allowed rulers to commission monuments intended for eternity. Resilience and renewal. The morning when Genghis Khan's siege engines finally breached the walls of Samarkand in 1220 seemed to mark the end of a world. Contemporary chroniclers describe the systematic destruction that followed: buildings reduced to rubble, libraries burned, irrigation channels filled with debris, and populations either killed or driven into slavery. The Great Convergence appeared to have collapsed into chaos, the patient work of centuries undone in weeks of calculated destruction. Yet even as smoke rose from the ruins of the ancient city, the seeds of renewal were already stirring. The Mongols, for all their reputation as destroyers, proved to be practical rulers who understood the value of the trade networks they had disrupted. Within decades of the conquest, they were actively encouraging the reconstruction of commercial facilities and the restoration of the routes that brought wealth to their new empire. The Pax Mongolica that emerged in the 13th century created conditions more favorable to long-distance trade than had existed for centuries. Marco Polo, traveling through this reconstructed world in the 1270s, found Samarkand once again functioning as a very large and splendid city. His account reveals how completely the city had recovered from the Mongol devastation, its markets once more filled with goods from across Eurasia, its workshops producing the textiles and metalwork that had made the region famous. The speed of this recovery speaks to the deep roots of commercial culture in Central Asia, to social and economic patterns that ran too deep to be permanently disrupted by even the most thorough conquest. The Mongol period also saw innovations in the infrastructure of trade that built upon earlier Sogdian achievements. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, created a network of way stations and supply depots that extended from Eastern Europe to the Pacific coast of China. This system not only facilitated official communication but also provided the foundation for expanded commercial activity, offering merchants reliable stopping points and standardized services across vast distances. Perhaps the most remarkable recovery occurred in the 14th century under Timur, the Turkic conqueror who chose Samarkand as the capital of his new empire. Unlike the Mongols, whose primary interest lay in extracting wealth from conquered territories, Timur conceived of his capital as a showcase of imperial magnificence that would rival the greatest cities of the ancient world. The Samarkand that emerged from his building campaigns represented not merely restoration but transformation, a city designed to embody the highest achievements of Islamic civilization. The architectural monuments commissioned during Timur's reign still dominate Samarkand's skyline today. The Registan, built by his grandson Ulugh Beg in the early 15th century, creates a public space of breathtaking grandeur, where three madrasas face each other across a vast square, their facades decorated with tile work of such intricacy and brilliance that they seem to capture and reflect all the light of heaven. The scale of such projects required not only enormous wealth, but also the organizational capacity to coordinate the work of craftsmen brought from across the empire, calligraphers from Baghdad, tile workers from Kashan, architects from Herat. This renewal was not limited to individual monuments, but encompassed the entire urban fabric. Timur's Samarkand featured broad avenues lined with workshops and trading halls, gardens that provided both beauty and practical shade, and residential quarters organized to accommodate the diverse populations that imperial policies encouraged to settle in the capital. The city became a laboratory for urban planning that influenced the development of capitals from Istanbul to Delhi. The success of this reconstruction demonstrates the enduring appeal of the oasis city model. Despite changing political circumstances, the fundamental requirements that had shaped places like Samarkand and Bukhara remained constant. The need for secure storage and accommodation, for neutral spaces where different cultures could interact safely, for institutions that could resolve disputes and enforce agreements across cultural boundaries. The architectural solutions developed over centuries proved remarkably adaptable to new circumstances. The maritime extensions. While the great land routes through Central Asia captured the imagination of medieval chroniclers and continue to dominate modern discussions of the Silk Roads, the maritime networks that connected the Indian Ocean world proved equally important in fostering urban centers of exchange. Cities like Alexandria, which served as the Mediterranean terminus for goods arriving from the east, developed their own distinctive character as cosmopolitan gathering places. Alexandria's position at the interface between the Nile River system and Mediterranean sea routes gave the city advantages comparable to those enjoyed by Central Asian oases. Founded by Alexander the Great on a site chosen for its natural harbors and connection to Egypt's interior waterways, Alexandria became a model for port cities designed to facilitate long-distance trade. The famous lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, served as both navigational aid and symbol of the city's role as a beacon for international commerce. The infrastructure required to support Alexandria's maritime trade created urban spaces quite different from the enclosed courtyards of Central Asian caravanserais, yet serving similar functions. The Great Harbor Complex included not only docking facilities for ships arriving from across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, but also warehouses for storing goods, markets for wholesale transactions, and quarters for the foreign merchants who made their temporary or permanent homes in the city. Ibn Battuta's description of Alexandria in 1326 captures the continued vitality of these maritime centers. Remarkable in appearance, and solid of construction, furnished with all that one could wish for in the way of embellishment and embattlement, and in remarkable edifices both secular and religious. Even after more than a millennium of operation, the city retained its character as a place where the products and cultures of the East met those of the West. The maritime routes also fostered the development of specialized port cities throughout the Indian Ocean world. Muscat, controlling the entrance to the Persian Gulf, became a center for the pearl trade and the transshipment of goods between Arabia and India. Goa, on India's west coast, served similar functions for trade between the subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Each of these cities developed its own version of the institutions: markets, warehouses, accommodation for foreign merchants, that characterized successful commercial centers throughout the Silk Road networks. The living architecture of exchange. The physical structures that housed Silk Road commerce represent one of humanity's earliest attempts to create architecture specifically designed for cross-cultural interaction. The evolution of caravanserai design, from simple fortified enclosures to sophisticated complexes that could accommodate hundreds of people from different backgrounds, reflects centuries of practical experimentation in the creation of neutral spaces where strangers could gather safely. The finest examples of these buildings achieved a remarkable balance between security and openness. The massive walls and single entrance provided protection against bandits and political instability, while the internal organization encouraged the social interactions that made long-distance trade possible. The central courtyard served multiple functions: as a marketplace where goods could be displayed and evaluated, as a social space where merchants from different cultures could meet and exchange information, and as a logistical center where caravans could be organized and reorganized for the next stage of their journeys. The architectural details of these structures speak to sophisticated understanding of the practical requirements of international commerce. Storage areas along the walls provided secure accommodation for valuable goods, while separate quarters allowed merchants to maintain the religious observances and dietary restrictions that enabled them to travel far from home without compromising their cultural identity. Stables accommodated the animals whose strength made the entire enterprise possible, while workshops allowed for the maintenance and repair of equipment damaged during difficult journeys. Perhaps most importantly, these buildings created spaces that belonged to no single culture while remaining hospitable to all. The geometric decorations that adorned the finest caravanserais drew from multiple artistic traditions without favoring any particular one. The architectural proportions created environments that felt neither foreign nor familiar to visitors from different backgrounds, but simply appropriate for the serious business of commerce conducted across cultural boundaries. The influence of caravanserai design extended far beyond the buildings themselves. The organizational principles developed in these structures, the balance between private and communal space, the integration of commercial and residential functions, the accommodation of diverse populations within unified architectural frameworks, influenced urban planning throughout the regions touched by Silk Road trade. Elements of caravanserai design can be traced in the layouts of bazaars from Istanbul to Beijing, in the organization of merchant quarters in medieval European cities, and in the design of trading posts established by European companies during the age of maritime exploration. Daily rhythms in the cities of exchange. The pulse of life in a great Silk Road city followed rhythms unknown in purely agricultural or purely military settlements. The daily cycle began before dawn, when the calls to prayer from multiple traditions created a complex musical pattern that spoke of the city's diverse spiritual life. Muslim muezzins called the faithful to their devotions, while Zoroastrian priests tended the sacred fires that burned continuously in their temples, and Buddhist monks struck gongs that resonated across courtyards filled with morning mist. As the sun rose, the sounds of commerce gradually overwhelmed those of worship. Metal rang against metal in the smiths' quarters, where craftsmen shaped the tools and ornaments that travelers would carry to distant markets. The rhythmic thud of looms marked the textile districts, where weavers created the silk fabrics and wool carpets that formed the backbone of long-distance trade. In the leather-working areas, the sharp scent of tanning rose into the warming air, while nearby, potters shaped clay into vessels designed to survive journeys measured in months rather than days. The markets themselves operated according to schedules that balanced local convenience with the requirements of long-distance trade. Wholesale transactions involving entire caravan loads of goods typically occurred in the early morning hours when the air was cool and merchants could conduct their business before the heat of the day. Retail trade, serving local customers, continued throughout the day, while evening brought a different character to the commercial districts as taverns and tea houses opened their doors to travelers seeking companionship and information about conditions along the routes ahead. The complexity of managing such diverse populations created challenges that required innovative solutions. Different communities maintained their own religious calendars, dietary restrictions, and commercial customs, yet all had to function within shared urban spaces. The successful Silk Road cities developed flexible approaches to governance that allowed for this diversity while maintaining the order necessary for commerce to flourish. Legal systems evolved to handle disputes between parties who might follow different laws and speak different languages. Commercial courts developed procedures that relied on witnesses and evidence rather than oaths whose religious significance might vary between cultures. Standard weights and measures were maintained and verified by civic authorities, while market regulations ensured that foreign merchants received fair treatment regardless of their origin or the local political situation. The heritage of connection. Standing today in the restored courtyards of Registan Square in Samarkand, or walking through the narrow lanes of Bukhara's old city, where UNESCO protection preserves medieval urban patterns, visitors can still sense the extraordinary achievement these places represent. The buildings that survive speak not only of architectural mastery, but of a vision of human possibility. The belief that strangers from different cultures can gather in shared spaces and create something greater than any could achieve alone. The influence of these urban experiments extended far beyond their original geographic and temporal boundaries. The organizational principles developed in Silk Road cities, the integration of commerce with culture, the accommodation of diversity within unified frameworks, the creation of neutral spaces where different traditions could interact safely, provided models that influenced urban development across Eurasia and beyond. The merchants who learned their trade in the bazaars of Central Asia carried their knowledge to trading centers from Novgorod to Calicut, while the architectural innovations pioneered in places like Samarkand and Bukhara found expression in buildings from Cordoba to Kashgar. The social technologies developed to enable cross-cultural commerce, systems of credit, standardized weights and measures, procedures for dispute resolution, provided foundations for the commercial law that would eventually enable global trade networks. Perhaps most importantly, These cities demonstrated that diversity could be a source of strength rather than division. In places where geography and commerce created incentives for cooperation, human ingenuity found ways to transform cultural difference from a barrier into an asset. The hybrid artistic styles, the fusion cuisines, the multilingual poetry that emerged from these cosmopolitan centers represent early experiments in the creation of truly global culture. The archaeological layers beneath modern Central Asian cities continue to yield evidence of this remarkable achievement. Recent excavations in the ruins of ancient Samarkand reveal workshop areas where craftsmen from different traditions worked side by side, residential quarters where families from various cultures lived as neighbors, and religious complexes where multiple faiths were practiced within the same architectural frameworks. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding of how human beings created societies that functioned across the boundaries of language, religion, and ethnicity. Modern development projects inspired by Silk Road history, from China's Belt and Road Initiative to UNESCO's Silk Roads program, explicitly invoke the memory of these ancient cities as models for contemporary international cooperation. While the specific challenges of the 21st century differ dramatically from those faced by medieval merchants, the fundamental questions remain remarkably similar. How can different cultures interact productively? What institutions enable trust between strangers? How can diversity become a source of mutual enrichment rather than conflict? The answers worked out over centuries in places like Chang'an, Samarkand, and Bukhara provide no simple formulas for contemporary challenges, but they do offer proof that such challenges can be met. In the covered bazaars where merchants still sell goods that their ancestors traded 1,000 years ago, in the caravanserais that now house restaurants and hotels, but still welcome travelers from distant lands, in the madrasas where students continue to gather from across the region to pursue learning, the spirit of the Silk Road cities lives on, a testament to humanity's ancient and enduring capacity for connection across difference. As evening light fades over these ancient crossroads, and the sounds of modern traffic gradually give way to the quieter rhythms of night, it becomes possible to imagine the whispered conversations of merchants planning tomorrow's departures, the gentle splash of fountains in courtyard gardens, and the soft footsteps of pilgrims making their way to prayer. In such moments, the cities of the Silk Roads reveal themselves not merely as historical artifacts, but as continuing expressions of the human impulse to reach across the vast spaces that separate us, seeking the connections that make us whole.